You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Today, June 26, 2025, a global showdown is happening in Orlando on the pitch. Coming up, how the City Beautiful is welcoming soccer royalty and the huge international fan base that's growing right in our backyard. But first, here on Engage, Florida lawmakers finally agreed on the best way to spend your tax dollars. The state Senate and House adopted a $115 billion budget last week, about 6 weeks after their original session deadline. Now, Governor Ron DeSantis has until the end of the month to sign it or use his line item veto power to cut specific parts. That's something he talked about on Monday.
And it's unfortunate, but the reality is, the House leadership drug this out for 45 days for really no reason at all. The budget that was enacted is not any type of sea change. There was no major policy victories in it. It was something that could have been done 45 days ago.
Republican Senate President Ben Albritton didn't view the missed deadline as a failure, saying, quote, "We dug in deep," end quote. Now that the extended legislative session that was often overshadowed by that infighting between Republican leaders and the governor is over, let's try and better understand what the spending plan is actually going to mean for the average Central Floridian. To do that, we're joined by two journalists who covered all the policy and political debate in Tallahassee. Jim Saunders is executive editor of the News Service of Florida, and Douglas Soul is a state government reporter for WUSF. They joined Engage to talk about what services are getting funded and what didn't make the cut. This is Florida's first smaller budget since 2011. Jim Saunders starts by explaining what's behind that drop.
Well, I think a large part of it is that Florida, since the pandemic started, has had a humongous influx of federal money. And that money is basically dried up. It's gone away. So that is reflected in this budget in the sense that kind of padded the budget in recent years. I think also there was some concerted effort by both the House and Senate leaders to try to rein in spending a little bit this year. I think there's some concerns about the economy, whether that's going to contract or at least not grow as much here in the next couple of years. So they're trying to brace the state for that a little bit, as well as there's a lot of uncertainty about federal cuts in spending for programs like Medicaid, which makes up a huge part of the state budget. So they basically have been saying for months that they need to kind of rein it in a little bit this year to sort of prepare for the future.
Jim, you mentioned Medicaid. Let's talk about where the money is going, and Health and Human Services gets a massive share of the revenue. And we're talking about Medicaid, senior care, child welfare, cancer research. I could go on and on. It's huge. Let me ask you, Jim, anything that stood out to you in terms of either general revenue or specifically Health and Human Services?
Every year, Health and Human Services is the largest part of the budget. I mean, a lot of people would think it's education, but it's actually Health and Human Services, and most of that is made up of Medicaid. The Health and Human Services part of the budget is $47 billion plus of this proposed budget, and that is not going to shrink much when the vetoes come out because it's sort of baked in. It's an entitlement program for those people who qualify. Medicaid by far is the largest portion of the HHS budget. So that's an issue every year. And you mentioned general revenue, which, in layman's speak, general revenue is the flexible pot of money that the legislature can use. And it goes big towards funding education, the state's share of healthcare, and also prisons. That's primarily what general revenue goes to. Assuming the budget, if DeSantis did not veto a bunch of stuff, general revenue actually will go up over the coming year. Not a lot, but it will go up. Primarily, it's money from sales taxes, insurance taxes, state investments, those sorts of things.
The governor has line item veto power. Based on your experience in covering this session and the governor, do you know what could be most at risk of that veto pen, Douglas?
Governor Ron DeSantis, he has to sign this by the end of the month, talking about only a few days for him to make those decisions. I would imagine that we would see a lot of kind of the more personal projects, the district by district projects, looked at by the governor in this sense. He cut a pretty big chunk out of the budget last year and the year before. He always endeavors to make such cuts to kind of tout his fiscal conservatism. So I would imagine that happens similarly here this week in the coming days.
I agree with all that, but I also think that anything that has the House Speaker's fingerprint on it might get vetoed. You know, the governor and the House Speaker, Daniel Perez, have really been in a personal feud over the past few months. And I have a feeling that the governor might take that out a little bit on him in budget vetoes. And you can be guaranteed that there's stuff in that budget that the House Speaker wants, especially he's from Miami-Dade County, which a lot of money goes to Miami-Dade County. So I think we're going to be watching to see sort of who some of the members are who wanted certain projects to whether DeSantis vetoes them. He's already said, and as we're discussing this, we haven't seen, as Douglas said, we haven't seen the veto list. He's talking about vetoing more than $500 million. And, you know, there's a lot of projects that could go by the wayside when you're talking that kind of money.
And obviously, the big question after that point, once you get the list of line item vetoes, is will the legislature try to override it? Saw some of that action over the past few months from our legislature. We also saw in some cases the Senate and House not seeing necessarily eye to eye on overrides. So even once the budget is signed, there's still going to be a lot of conversations about the budget in the coming months.
How much did you see that back and forth that you mentioned between Governor DeSantis and legislative leaders, especially House Speaker Perez, influence just this whole process?
I think it shadowed the entire session. I think that's why it's not the only reason that the budget didn't get done in time and they had to extend the session, but it really shadowed the whole session. We had never seen in the governor's first 6 years in office, we had never seen the legislature really take him on. And Speaker Perez did on a lot of issues, including some issues that were personal to the governor, such as the Hope Florida program. And so there was a lot of tension during the session, much more than there has been among Republicans over the past, really, as long as I can, at least in recent years. I think that played a large role in the session overall. I also think it affected the budget negotiations. And the Senate, in the end, sort of started to maybe not go with the governor on all the budget issues, but I think it was widely viewed as more friendly to the governor on budget issues. And that tension was very noticeable.
And just as an example of that, the first plan between the House and the Senate, which was announced on what's usually the last day of session, the 60th day, exploded when DeSantis said he'd veto it. And when that happened, Perez even accused Albritton, the Senate president, of breaking his word, which is quite the criticism in the halls of the Capitol. And also in recent months, we've seen Governor DeSantis continually lob House Speaker Perez with criticisms and insults, as well as other House members.
Well, and part of the issue is that the governor has made a very public stance of wanting to reduce property taxes. And the legislature, particularly the House, did not want to move forward with some ambitious property tax cut at this year. The House put out a proposal to reduce the sales tax rate by like $5 billion, which basically flew right in the face of any property tax cuts. In the end, that sales tax rate reduction didn't go anywhere, but also the property tax cuts did not go anywhere. So they were kind of at a stalemate, and that's one of the budget issues, budget-related issues that really hung things up. They are going to study property tax cuts, but there's no guarantee at this point what's going to come out of that.
Now, sales tax holidays currently are included in this budget, and these can be really popular with the average person. We're talking back-to-school holidays, disaster preparedness holidays for hurricane supplies. Can you talk to how meaningful are these? Did people even care when they didn't have them this year?
Particularly the sales tax holiday for back-to-school shoppers has been really popular. It started in the 90s, and it's been held pretty much every year since then. There were a couple years when they didn't, or they really shortened it. Basically, what this final tax package will do will make it permanent, that they won't have to revisit it. The legislature won't have to revisit it every year. It'll just happen every August. So I think that'll be going to be a popular thing. You know, the retailers love these because it helps them market and get people into their stores. There are studies that have been done and think tanks have looked at this and about whether there really is much value overall economically to these tax holidays, because people are going to buy their school supplies regardless, kind of theory. But politically, it's very popular. And I mean, Perez, the House Speaker, at one point called these things gimmicks. But in the end, he came around on it too, to what's in the final tax package.
And I would say that consumers and Floridians, they're definitely somewhat aware, maybe more than other policies that pass, of these tax holidays. I was just fishing at a lake in Tallahassee where I live, and Jim lives as well. And I heard a fisherman mention how he was waiting to buy some fishing gear for that hunting, fishing, camping tax holiday that was created for the fall.
We are talking with Douglas Soul, WUSF state government reporter, as he mentioned, based in Tallahassee, and Jim Saunders, executive editor of the News Service of Florida. I would like to ask you both, who are this year's biggest budget winners and losers? Douglas.
The first answer that comes to mind is that businesses themselves won pretty big in this process. The legislature passed a $1.3 billion tax cut package, and the biggest chunk of that goes to getting rid of the business rent tax. Many business owners, at least, came away with wins in regard to that specific cut.
And same question to you, Jim. Biggest budget winners?
I actually think that's a really good selection on the winners. Basically, it's a sales tax. It's on commercial rent. And the business lobbies have fought for years to get rid of this tax. They say it's unfair, that Florida's, I think they say, the only state that has this kind of tax. It's a $900 million tax. It's not small change.
I wouldn't really classify this as a loser situation because it was the result of the negotiations and compromises made behind closed doors largely. But of course, it should be stated that House Speaker Daniel Perez didn't get his across-the-board sales tax reduction, which he really, really loudly called for. In the same vein, Senate President Ben Albritton didn't get his rural renaissance legislation, which would have provided developmental aid and other aid to rural counties in Florida.
So now that the legislature's budget is done, I guess the extended session there is closed. To wrap up, any memorable or favorite moments from this year's extended session for either of you?
I don't mean to sound like a smart aleck, but the most memorable was when they were done. I mean, it it went from May 2nd till like a month. It just was in this total, just there was nothing happening, at least publicly, which was really bizarre because the clock was also ticking. I mean, the fiscal year starts July 1st. They had to pass something and come back. And then we were just sitting here waiting, trying to figure out what was going on. There were a million rumors going on. And finally, they came back. And as Douglas said, pretty much they negotiated all of this stuff behind the scenes.
You know, my favorite part was certainly getting to work alongside Jim Saunders, but in terms of the most memorable, I think it's kind of amazing how much time we as journalists this session kind of spent waiting, especially like during the budget negotiation process in the Capitol. There was a day where we expected a morning meeting where we definitely didn't get that, and we were just kind of like sitting, waiting, begging in some cases for more information. A lot of these budget negotiations are behind closed doors, and we're eager to get that information, though, out to the public as quickly as possible. Of course, we have the completed budget now, all hundreds of pages of it, and now the big question is, what is DeSantis' team doing behind closed doors in terms of these line item budget vetoes?
Douglas Soul is WUSF state government reporter based in Tallahassee. Jim Saunders is executive editor of the News Service of Florida. Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
One of the largest pieces of the state budget goes to education. It lays out a plan to fund public schools, teacher salaries, scholarships, and other legislative priorities. Central Florida Public Media education reporter Danielle Pryor joins Engage now to help us understand how it all impacts the future of education in the state. Thanks for being here, Danielle.
Thanks for having me.
So we spoke a bit about this earlier here on Engage. On Monday, Governor DeSantis said the extended session dragged on unnecessarily and that he is currently reviewing the budget, which is higher than what he originally recommended at the beginning of the year.
So the reality is that's $500 million And, I think if some of the House leadership is saying that we're spending too much and whatever, then don't I have to take at least $500 million off to get under what I recommended to be able to get where we are? So we're going to be going through all this and making, very sound decisions. But the reality is we have less than 2 weeks with a lot of stuff on our desk. And there's all these things that get put in the budget, and I have to approve or veto each one individually.
So, Danielle, could we see some money be cut from education?
Probably not, because the legislature agreed to $29.5 billion for education, which is only a 3% increase from last year. And then the governor himself, in his proposed budget, had planned on about $29.7 billion. So those numbers are essentially the same for education. Plus, the legislature gave him a lot of what he asked for, things like raises for teachers, more money for VPK and mental health, and of course, also more money for school vouchers. So I highly doubt that he'll take out the red pen when it comes to education, because these are issues that are very important to him and to his base.
Let me throw another number at you. $4 billion is going to the Universal Voucher Program. That is a big number. Help me understand, is that an expansion, and what does that say about school choice in Florida to you?
Yeah, so actually in our last budget, the number was $3.9 billion. So it's not a huge change. Where we saw the big jump, Sharon, was in 2023, and that was because of universal vouchers taking effect here in Florida. So obviously the money in the budget had to increase as well, because almost anybody could apply at that point. But the Florida Policy Institute estimated vouchers would cost the state about $4 billion this year. So that number is pretty on par with those estimates. And we do know that these programs are growing here in Florida. We have spoken previously that more than 500,000 students are now on vouchers in Florida. And then last week, I reported on the fact that over half of all students in Florida are now at a school of choice, which means that they're in a private or charter school or some other program besides for their zoned public neighborhood school. So we do see a shift away from traditional schools here in Florida, and that's often the case in states where there's universal voucher programs.
Tell me more about the impact on public schools then.
We've had a lot of schools in our areas announce layoffs, drops in enrollment for the coming school year. In our area, Orange Lake, Seminole, and Volusia County schools have all estimated that they're going to lose thousands of kids next school year, partially because of voucher programs, also because of other factors. And because the funding follows the student in Florida, that means every time a public school loses a student, they're going to be losing that per pupil state funding. And we've seen a lot of schools announce deficits and budget shortfalls. So Orange County Schools says that they could have a shortfall of $27.8 million. Lake County is $35 million. Seminole County, $16.7 million. And Volusia, a deficit of $25.8 million. And schools are having to make difficult choices about what to cut.
Tell me more about the per student funding increase. Talk to me about what that actually means for districts. Where does the money go? Does it vary by region?
Yeah, so the per student funding for public schools in total will only increase by about $143 per student, which means that schools will get about $9,130 per student in the budget. Of that total, this only raises the base student allocation, which is the number that schools can use to pay teacher salaries. That only raises that number by $42 per student. So the Florida Education Association, which is the state's largest teachers union, says that amount doesn't really even keep up with inflation, that $42 extra per kid for things like, teacher salaries and other expenses. And then there's the fact that the Florida Education Finance Program uses this formula to calculate state funding, and it means that every school gets a different amount of funding to start with. And this formula looks at things like student demographics, district characteristics, local property values. And even though it's supposed to kind of level the playing field, studies have shown that lower income districts usually get less funding, even though higher income districts have other revenue streams that they can kind of make up for a loss in funding. So experts really suggest that school districts in these lower socioeconomic areas have the most to lose with all of these changes happening with public schools.
We're talking with Central Florida Public Media education reporter Danielle Pryor about this year's budget. The National Education Association ranks Florida last in the country for teacher pay, Danielle. The Florida Department of Education has said that association is a politically driven teachers union manipulating data to fit their narrative. Are you seeing anything in this state budget that would significantly impact teacher and staff salaries?
So it's interesting because the budget includes $101 million for teacher pay raises. That's what the legislature has set aside. But the governor actually asked for and wanted $246.7 million. He wanted twice as much for teacher raises. So his was a really historic amount and would have represented a healthy pay raise. Theirs not so much. The problem is that Florida ranks 50th in the country for teacher pay, so you're already starting out so low. And the Florida Education Association just says, look, $101 million, which is what the legislature wants, is only about $20 more per paycheck per teacher. And so that really doesn't do a lot to raise Florida's standing when it comes to teacher pay. And also, it doesn't take into account things like inflation, rising food and rent prices. $20 more per week isn't a lot more money.
There are a couple of other items that really jumped out to me I want to ask you about. There's money focused on mental health. There's money focused on safe schools allocations. What does that funding support?
Absolutely. So mental health funding gives each district money to set up or expand their school-wide, school-based mental health care program. They can use this money to train educators and other staff to identify and respond to a child having a mental health crisis or who has mental health problems. They can help connect students and families with appropriate services even outside of school to get that mental health care. With the school safety money, this money can go to all sorts of things. It can help pay for school resource officers, after school programs, bullying and suicide prevention, conflict resolution prevention, and also improvements to enhance the actual building, the hardening of school buildings. So updating infrastructure with new technology and other things that can just make schools safer. The goal with both is to keep students safe mentally and physically, as we've seen a rise, sadly, in school violence and school shootings. So a lot of these things went into effect post-Parkland.
Before I let you go, Danielle, there are a couple of education laws that take effect on July 1st. What is happening with cell phones in schools?
This is harkens back to my own private school days where we weren't allowed to have cell phones. So when school starts in Florida next fall, elementary and middle school students at public schools won't be able to use their cell phones from the first bell of the day to the last bell of the day. And then the high schoolers will be allowed to use their phones outside of class, depending on what rules the district set. But they also won't be able to have their phones out during class time unless their teacher says, hey, you need your phone out for this lesson. So this is a huge change for K-12 students. And then you asked about other education laws taking effect as well. A majority of the new laws, probably almost half of the laws that the governor has signed into effect are education related. So we've got expanded funding and services for students with autism, schools being required to have AEDs and glucagon for medical emergencies. Teachers will be required to take human trafficking prevention training. We will have different pathways to certification for former inmates. Even new drivers will be required to go through more training and education before they can get their license.
Any other takeaways you'd like to leave our audience with about the budget and laws shaping education in Florida?
Yes, there was a pretty big concern that AP or IB funding would be cut in the budget. But the good news is it is not. Schools are still getting a $597 million supplement, and these programs are fully funded. It's not going to be funded in the same way. They won't get like a per pupil amount of money, but they'll get a grant. So districts will get kind of a one-time grant, and then they can use that as they see fit. But the good news is this was not zeroed out in the budget as people were worried about and concerned about.
That was a lot to throw at you. Thank you so much, Central Florida Public Media education reporter Danielle Pryor. Thanks for helping us understand the impacts.
Thank you.
Do you think the state is spending in the right places? Let us know your thoughts. Email us at engage@cfpublic.org or send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app, or you can text 833-793-9633. There's more ahead here on Engage. The Pink Pistols of Central Florida is a gun advocacy group catering to the LGBTQ+ community. Engage producer Richard Copeland visits the range with them and talks to the group Gays Against Guns about their activism toward ending gun violence. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. FBI data released late last year showed a marked increase in hate crimes targeting members of LGBTQ+ communities. Engaged producer Richard Copeland spoke with Central Floridians looking to protect themselves from those crimes.
It's a Sunday afternoon in early June, and I'm at Shoot Straight in Apopka. It's a massive store with rifles and shotguns lining the walls, and spotless glass cases filled with pistols ringing the floor. Taxidermied animals are the primary decor. The shooting range is in the back. There are about 15 shooting lanes, exactly like you see cops use in the movies. This is where I met the Pink Pistols of Central Florida.
Depending on how far the target is away, the bullet always drops a little bit. So where you actually put that front blade on the target kind of depends how far the target is away.
The voice you're hearing belongs to Mac. He organizes these outings as well as self-defense and emergency trauma first aid classes for Pink Pistols. The group began as a national movement in 2000, a loosely structured confederacy of regional chapters, encouraging queer people to arm themselves in self-defense in the face of rising hate crime statistics and personal experiences. Their motto? Pick on someone your own caliber. 7 people showed up for Mac's range day at Shoot Straight. After a 2-hour instructional shooting session, I sat down with the group at a nearby tavern to learn about what is anecdotally a growing trend: queer gun ownership. These weren't members. They were just curious about guns. They asked that we only use their first names out of a sense of personal safety.
At first I was very intimidated by it, but after, I guess, like the third or fourth gun I was handling, I got more used to it.
That's Ash. They are non-binary, and they never touched a gun before. Kit was another first-timer at Pink Pistols Range Day. She explained why she chose to attend.
After the election, seeing how everything was going politically, the way they're ratcheting up rhetoric against the LGBT community, it seems like they are intentionally demonizing us in a way that will make the community feel comfortable targeting us for violence. And I feel like I have a responsibility to do what I can to protect myself and my family. So we're looking at every possible way that we can be prepared. And I'd never handled a gun before. I felt really uncomfortable with guns. I had family members that were hunters, and they were really careless with weapons. So it wasn't something I felt comfortable around. But it's an incredible tool that we're legally allowed to have to defend ourselves in this country, and I felt like maybe that's something I need to look at for my family very seriously. And that's how I connected with the Pink Pistols and reached out and was like, hi, so are you guys active? How can I find out more? I want to be responsible in learning how to handle a gun and learning how to do first aid and anything that I might need to know so that I can do this the right way.
For most people attending Pink Pistols Range Day, this was the very first time they ever handled a gun. LGBTQ+ and gun-owning communities aren't thought of as having much intersection. Jules, another first-timer at the range, explained why she thinks the current political climate is changing this.
It's one of those things where you're like, we've seen this in history. We've seen what happens when you take a target group and you make them a scapegoat and you turn everyone against them, and then people stop caring because they seem no longer human. And I did not think it was going to happen here. I thought that we would be more mindful of the history and prevent those same things. And so to hear that conversation, to think about, can we get ourselves out of this mess that we have allowed ourselves to fall into? And if we can't, do we have to be prepared to defend ourselves against something a little more extreme than a bunch of bullies? You know, that's a terrifying thought. It's not the country I grew up in.
Stephen isn't new to guns. This is his 4th time attending a shooting event with Pink Pistols. But as enthusiastic as he is about learning more about gun ownership, he is a reluctant participant.
I don't like guns. My favorite countries are Australia, Japan, and France. Wonder why? You know what I mean? I don't like guns as a principle, but I feel it's necessary. I didn't want to feel that way, But I think that people now need to protect themselves. It's that the threat is very much alive, and our own government is kind of actively supporting it. When we have madmen tweeting about blame these people for your problems when we know that they're the source of our problems.
Following the tragic mass shooting at Pulse nightclub in 2016, support for gun control legislation was galvanized among the region's gay and trans communities. Kit spoke about how that position has been softening over the past year and her friends' responses to her wanting to purchase a gun.
I feel like there's a little bit of shock at first, and then understanding. It's definitely not something that they would have predicted that we would ever do until now. And when we say, we're going to be doing this now, and they're like, oh, yeah, you should do that now. So it's kind of, it's a surprise, but also one that makes sense, I think, is the feedback I'm getting.
For Kit and her partner Jules, the fear is tangible. They spoke about their cars being vandalized, about friends who had been physically attacked, about being afraid of wearing a Hamilton t-shirt out of fear of being labeled gay. I asked Kit if she envisioned scenarios that would require her to use a gun.
We could be going about our daily lives at a grocery store parking lot or something and get attacked by someone and have to use a weapon to defend ourselves. Or someone to come to our house and we don't have any outward pride flags or anything like that because that's a fear that it would make us a target.
Much of what I heard sounded similar to the rhetoric from armed militias, the kind of us against them narrative that leads people to believe a gun is absolutely necessary for survival. I asked Kit what makes a group like Pink Pistols different from some of the more militant organizations that promote gun ownership. She explained what sets Pink Pistols apart from groups like the Oath Keepers or Proud Boys.
If you listen to the kinds of things that we say, I feel like we sound different than right-wing groups do, where we're not like, oh, guns are so amazing and it's all about that. We're like, I care about my right to live and my family and keeping people safe. And I feel like that's a really different conversation than the ones that you hear on that side. And we're like, well, we'll use the tools that are available to us and we'll do it responsibly, as opposed to putting the focus in, well, I'm going to be, armed and violent or whatever because I don't like people doing things.
It's a resorting to that because of eroding freedoms.
It's about what you can protect, not what you can destroy.
Right.
A Pink Pistols member who was not in attendance that day is Erin Paulette. She is the national coordinator for the Pink Pistols, and Paulette describes herself as a, quote, pro-gun transgender lesbian who believes that gun rights are queer rights. The Palm Coast resident is also the founder of Operation Blazing Sword, a grassroots organization dedicated to helping everyone, but especially queer people, become responsible firearm owners. Paulette ultimately wants to dispel what she sees as a myth, that gun owners hate LGBTQ people. She spoke to me about why she thinks gun control efforts compromise the safety of the queer community.
Prohibition does not work. It has been proven not to work. We have tried prohibiting drugs. We have tried prohibiting alcohol. Not only has this failed to work, it has made things worse. Because when we prohibited alcohol, that is what prompted the rise of organized crime as a result of bootleggers. And that led us to the gang problem and the drug problem that we have today. Furthermore, murder is illegal. It's one of the most illegal things we can do, not just in this country, but across the world. And yet people still murder. If you are willing to break that law and violate that social code to kill another human being, a regulation prohibiting firearms will not stop you because the black market exists. If you're already going to kill, what is buying a hot gun out of the back of somebody's car? It's nothing. It is not easy to go into a store and buy a gun because there are forms you have to fill out. You have to show ID. And at any point, if the person selling you the gun feels that this isn't right, they can refuse you the sale, no questions asked.
What do you hear from other members of the region's LGBTQ plus community, and in what ways do they regard this movement?
The majority of queer people oppose firearms ownership, and they hate that I'm an advocate for it. And I don't think they've actually used the word traitor, but that's how they treat me. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people who don't want to come out as being gun owners. And there is a very ironic similarity to the way queer people are treated when it's known that they're gun owners as it was back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when they were revealed to be gay. There was a lot of naming and shaming and blaming. And it's usually some version of, why do you want a gun? Are you going to hurt somebody? Are you going to hurt yourself? Do you plan to kill people? Don't you realize that guns are used to kill us? Don't you realize that you are adding to the problem? You've got blood on your hands. I don't trust you anymore. You might lose your temper and shoot me. That kind of thing. And so there is a stigma. And a lot of people want to stay in the gun closet, as I like to say. However, the reason that I do what I do, in addition to getting the word out and teaching people who are gun curious, they think that they might want to learn how to use a gun to protect themselves, but they aren't certain. And so in addition to letting people know that the Second Amendment is for everyone, it's especially for you queer people, for us queer people, and that our education is free, but I'm also trying to normalize it because so there's a saying in the queer community that silence equals death. And this was coined back during the AIDS epidemic. And the idea behind it is that if you are silent, people can ignore you. And when people ignore you, then your plight is meaningless. And so you have to make yourself heard so that people acknowledge your existence. And people will see and hopefully acknowledge your suffering. And so one of the reasons I do what I do is to erase that silence. And so by being out there as a queer woman, a trans woman, and a gun owner, I am working to normalize firearms ownership, primarily within the queer community, but also in general.
That was Aaron Paulette, the national coordinator for Pink Pistols and founder of Operation Blazing Sword in Palm Coast. Despite the anecdotal evidence of a growing interest in gun ownership within LGBTQ plus communities, there is still a strong lobby to curtail universal gun ownership and the types of guns that are available to consumers. Ty Kersley is with Gays Against Guns, a nonprofit that was founded in 2016 following the Pulse shooting. Gays Against Guns advocates for ending gun violence. They successfully campaign to encourage corporations like FedEx to sever ties with the NRA. Kersley spoke to me about his concerns about the growing interest in guns within queer communities.
I think it's taken a while for us to realize the identity of a gun owner in some people resonates more than even being gay. And that's a product of this country and marketing. But we just stand by the truth that guns do not make us safer, doesn't make the country safer. Guns aren't used in self-defense as much as people purchase them for self-defense. You're more likely to die by the gun you bought or your spouse or your child. So there are tons and tons of regulations that are used with gun ownership or in the military or other jobs like cops and stuff. You have regulations, and trying to get those turned into law is where it stops. So I retired Air Force. I had to go to 2 wars. I had to have my ammo counted for, and I had to sign my name, put the weapon back in an armory with my social security number written down. So we had accountability, but even then there's, incidences with veterans when they get home, dealing with PTSD after the fact and being a gun owner. So all of these things bring the awareness to everyone about how dangerous gun ownership is, especially if it's an impulse purchase, which is what the gun industry looks for. They sell for hate and they sell for fear.
What would you say to a queer Central Floridian who says they've been bringing the fight to us with guns for years? We're just leveling the playing field and acknowledging that we share the same Second Amendment right.
But the right is there, and that's fine. Being a safe gun owner, that if you're terrified and you have to keep a gun in your bag or in your car, none of that is safe. Adding a gun to any equation, when you and I could have a disagreement or an argument in a room, but if that room has a gun in it, then that's already become a possible solution to end the disagreement. Like, that's how the mind works. So adding the gun only adds more aggression. But I understand the rights for people to own guns, and there's a camaraderie with it, and there's a lot that goes with it. But the majority of the time, it is not used in self-defense. So more guns do not make you safer.
I met with a Pink Pistols group here in Central Florida. We went to a range. I watched them shoot. I watched some of the instruction. I think there's about 6 or 7 people there. At least 4, maybe 5 of them, it was the very first time they ever picked up a gun. Didn't come from gun families. They never owned a gun. They never fired a gun. But something within the current environment is instilling that fear that you spoke about that is driving them to want to learn about guns.
Right. The fear is driving that, but the truth of how much you will use that weapon is a false sense of security. We're marketed to think we can all be cowboys. We can all be that one guy in the mall that has the gun that can shoot the other guy that's doing something wrong, but you don't really know what's going on. You don't know who else has a weapon around you, and you're more likely to be shot if you're armed. So all of that, someone can dismiss me and say no. They can be completely infatuated with the fact that they're going to be this person, but eventually they're going to be on the other side as a survivor. And anyone who says, well, I can do the same thing with a baseball bat. No, you can't. They had to blow out the walls to get in to stop someone who was armed. So it's only gun use. It's only these things that are causing this much destruction.
Back at the tavern with the Pink Pistols, shooting instructor Mac knows that ultimately guns are not a solution to hate, just protection from it. I asked him what his message is to Central Florida's LGBTQ youth in 2025.
It can be extremely difficult right now for individuals that are closeted, that are feeling threatened and at risk of trying to be who they are, to know that they're not alone and that there is a much larger community that is out there that also supports them and is looking forward to protecting them.
That was Engage producer Richard Copeland. We'd like to hear your take on this topic. You can email us at engage@cfpublic.org, send a talk back on the free Central Florida Public Media app, or text us 833-793-9633. Coming up here on Engage, world football fandom is kicking into high gear in Central Florida. Today, 2 global powerhouses and their international fan bases are taking over and spreading in Central Florida. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Orlando's Inter & Co Stadium and Camping World Stadium are 2 of the 12 venues in the country hosting matches for the FIFA Club World Cup happening now. Professional club teams like the current title holder Manchester City or Los Angeles FC and Inter Milan are competing for the best club team and a $1 billion total prize pool. For soccer fans here in Central Florida, it's still a chance to see some of the best players from around the world. A crowd gathered outside Murphy's Pub Orlando for a block party to get ready for today's match at Camping World Stadium between Juventus and Manchester City. That's where we met Carl, a Manchester resident who was visiting with some friends. We asked the difference between watching a match here versus back home in the UK.
It's really, 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 really hot here. Really hot. That will be the takeaway, how hot it is.
Oh, but it's not the heat, it's the humidity.
Whatever it is, it's hot.
Murphy's Pub Orlando is the meeting place for the Orlando citizens. It's a strategically chosen spot for Manchester City's official supporters club. It's on iDrive to cater to international tourists and local fans. Stephen Simon is the vice chair of the Orlando Citizens. The fan club has more than 38,000 fans on Facebook. Simon joins Engage to talk about the love for the club and his journey to becoming a Man City fan.
1994 World Cup is when here in the USA. That's when I fell in love with soccer, started playing it, and there was no MLS in the USA, so there were no teams. So I wanted a team to follow and support. And my mom is actually from England and originally from the north. So and my grandmother's side, and I looked at some teams in the north, and honestly, Oasis is what got me into it. Oasis was massive in 94, 95, 96, and they were and still are my favorite band. And they're massive Manchester City supporters. And I was like, all right, that's my team. And, through the early years, I followed them through internet radio, actually. That was the only way to catch games so that you could stream the radio broadcast of the game. So I'd wake up early and put on the big headphones in my parents' living room and listen to the games whenever they, Saturday, Sunday mornings. And then now it's great with all the streaming and stuff. I get to see every game.
Can you describe just kind of the spirit of Orlando Citizens to someone who has no idea that this is here or how big it is?
We're just a group of friends. Everybody gets along really well there. We all show up in our sky blue, watch Man City play, and have a few adult beverages and have a good time.
Responsibly only.
Yeah, of course.
Talk to me about, as someone living in Orlando, what does it mean to have Man City playing right at Camping World?
Oh, it's phenomenal. To play a game that matters on U.S. soil and to have it so close to home is unbelievable. So it's a great matchup for us. I've had this on my calendar since it was announced.
Tell me about match day. Is there a chant? Is there a tradition? Are there superstitions involved?
Oh man, there's a lot of different chants. There's a whole bunch. We had a player that just left us. He had a popular one. His name was Kevin De Bruyne. He had a very popular chant. There's probably 100 chants.
Okay.
So there's different ones that'll occur at different points. As far as superstitions, we have a certain member that if we need to score a goal, we'll send them to the bathroom because for some reason, whenever they went to the restroom, we would score. So that's definitely become a long-standing joke and tradition. I'm guilty of it. If it's a big game and the jersey that I wore last time we won in that one, I'll wear the same jersey. All that kind of nonsense stuff. Everybody has their own individual little things that they'll do. We have people that sit in the same seat every time.
You mean at Murphy's?
Yeah, at Murphy's. They'll sit in the same seat every time at Murphy's but just out of superstition.
Hey, whatever works, whatever you have to do to get the win, right?
Yep.
Stephen Simon is the vice chair of the Orlando Citizens. Manchester City faces another legendary pro soccer club, Juventus, based in Italy. Martina Beta is the president of the Juventus fan club of Central Florida. She says a small, tight-knit group is seeing a surge in interest because of the tournament matches happening in Orlando.
That's what we were all hoping for, either here in Miami, just like somewhere close that we could go to. So I was extremely happy. We immediately bought the tickets right away. Whenever we had the chance, as a fan club, we had we could buy the tickets before they went for sale. So we all got them together in the same section, in the Juventus section. So yeah, we're extremely excited. We've been planning for months. I bought them in December, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been a long 6 months of planning and preparing for this game and for this week. It's been incredible so far.
Have you seen the passion or interest even in soccer evolve in Florida over the years?
Yes, I definitely think it's growing. I feel like I know we've been trying to say that it's growing for a lot of years now, but I do think after Ronaldo joined Juventus, you could see a lot of more Juventus fans even in the States, like in Florida. Like sometimes I would walk and people would have jerseys on. So that's something I didn't see before he arrived at Juve. But I do see more and more of soccer fans in general around, which is it's good. I mean, I feel like it's something that's needed here. But yeah, it's something that obviously I'm a huge soccer fan. That's my sport. So yeah, hopefully it keeps growing, and with this tournament and the World Cup next year, it explodes even more because it will be amazing that more people follow the sport over here in the U.S.
Martina Beda is the president of the Juventus Fan Club of Central Florida. That's all for this week's edition of Engage. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.